epithelium is the lining tissue of most of our body surfaces, all of our internal cavities, our skin, our GI, the respiratory airway, the reproductive tract, all of that is lined by epithelium. So anytime the extracellular environment, not extracellular, the external body environment, anytime the external body environment comes in contact with the internal body environment, this is where we have a lining tissue that we call epithelium. Now, epithelial cells are really important for two big functions because of that location: absorption and secretion. We have to be able to move substances into our bloodstream across this layer, as well as secrete substances out like gastric juices, like waste products, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the big picture with the epithelial layer, and we'll describe how those particles actually move across, right? So they transport across this epithelial membrane. Now this involves two membranes here. There is a basolateral membrane as well as an apical membrane. So think about this as an example of your gastrointestinal lining. Let's say this is the lining of your GI tract. Let's say this is the luminal surface. This is where food is coming into the GI. And this is the blood, which is in the underlying interstitial space, the underlying connective tissue. And this is where we need those nutrients that are coming in to eventually get. So there are two surfaces that those nutrients, those biomolecules must move across. They got to move across the apical membrane as well as the basolateral membrane. So the apical membrane is this highly folded membrane that is closest to the lumen of that cavity or surface. And then the basolateral membrane is the bottom of the cell that is closest to the blood, right? We call it the blood-facing membrane or the blood-facing area. Okay, so movement of particles happens in both directions, from the blood out into the lumen and from the lumen into the blood. We also have tight junctions. So tight junctions are really important in anchoring those cells. So think about cells that are lining next to each other, right? Stacked one against each other. In order to keep this membrane, the integrity of this membrane, these cells are anchored to one another to prevent any paracellular movement of substances and to make sure that substances must go into the cell and out of the cell in order to move across this membrane. Okay. So let's describe some of the features of each of the membranes. So let's start with the basolateral surface or the basolateral membrane. We have the sodium-potassium pump here. Now we've encountered the sodium-potassium pump already. We talked about it. What type of transport is this? An example of the sodium-potassium pump. First of all, is it passive or active? It's active, right? It's going to require some energy. Is it primary or secondary? It's primary, right? It's going to require ATP. So the sodium-potassium pump is pumping 3 sodiums out of the cell, 2 sodiums into the cell. It's located at the basolateral surface, and it's really important in maintaining the relative concentrations of sodium and potassium in and out of the cell, okay? We also have this potassium leak channel. So the potassium leak channel, as we can see, facilitates the leakage of potassium down its concentration gradient from where it is being pumped into the cell at high concentration to where it can leak out of the cell according to its gradient. We also have glucose carriers. So we spoke about glucose carriers. Let's jump over here. And glucose carriers are these transporters that we also mentioned in terms of facilitated diffusion that allow the passive movement of glucose from the area where it is in high concentration to out in the blood where it is in low concentration, okay? This is how we can get glucose into our bloodstream to be circulated, to be used in our cells. What mechanism, what type of transport is that? Active or passive? The movement of glucose across the basolateral membrane. Well, the green arrows is kind of a giveaway, right? It's going to be a passive mechanism because there's more glucose in the cell and less glucose outside in the blood, okay? Now let's look at some structures on the apical membrane. So on the apical membrane, we have the sodium leak channel. So just like we saw with potassium, sodium can leak into the cell according to its concentration gradient. And then we also have the sodium-linked glucose pump, which is also part of this structure. And that is using the energy of sodium that's moving down its gradient to move glucose against its concentration. So we got more glucose inside, less glucose in the lumen. And so to move glucose against its concentration gradient, we're going to harness the energy of sodium moving according to its gradient. So those are some structures that are on the apical and basolateral surface. We can also speak about the movement of sodium. So as I mentioned earlier, sodium is at low concentrations inside the cell because of this sodium-potassium pump. It's being pumped out aggressively. And potassium is at high concentration inside the cell. And so these two ions can leak in the opposite direction, which is according to their gradient. And that too will help maintain the relative ion concentration. Okay? So sodium is transported into the cell, and as we mentioned before, we can harness that energy to move glucose against its gradient. Okay. All right, so this is an example of secondary active transport, something we spoke at length about before, across the apical membrane. We can also see examples of facilitated diffusion across the basolateral membrane. So facilitated diffusion requires what? Just as a review here, what does facilitated diffusion require? Does it require energy? No. What does it require? A carrier, perfect, so a carrier, one of our transmembrane proteins, which is the example of glucose down here. Okay, and so because of the fact that we have glucose at high concentration inside the cell and low concentrations out here, we can facilitate this movement passively. Okay, now the last thing we'll speak about here is the movement of water. So just like we can move solutes and particles, glucose, sodium, across the cell membrane, we must also move water across this epithelial membrane. Think about the absorption of water, right? We talked about the fact that water is not a biomolecule, meaning that the body cannot make water. We must bring water into our diet or into our GI tract. And so water must be able to move across the membrane, but it must also be able to move in the opposite direction. Think about making saliva. Think about making your gastric juices. Think about your other body secretions. That would require the movement of water in the opposite direction. So the way that we move water across the epithelia is by moving solutes into or out of the cell to create a solute gradient. And we talked about the fact that where there is a solute gradient, there is obviously also a water gradient in the opposite direction. So if we can pump solutes from the cell out into the interstitial space down here, we can create a gradient where there's high water concentration out here in the lumen and low water concentration down here where we have all this solute. And so we create this osmotic pressure where water wants to flow passively from the lumen where we've ingested water across into the bloodstream where it can be absorbed, okay? So this is how we can facilitate the movement of water by simply moving solutes out of the cell and into the interstitial space. Okay, so this brings me to cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a really interesting example of how this can go wrong, okay? So because we need to move solutes to create that water gradient when we're moving water across the membrane, in a situation where we want to create saliva or create mucus, which requires water, we have to pump solutes into the lumen and create a water gradient where water will flow from the interstitial space out into the lumen. That's how we make our gastric juices, our reproductive secretions, etc., etc. Now, cystic fibrosis patients do not have this ability. This is a genetic mutation which affects the chloride transporters, and so we cannot pump these solutes out into the lumen, and so essentially we cannot move water from the interstitial space out into the lumen. So we end up with thick, viscous secretions, thick, viscous saliva, thick, viscous mucus in the respiratory airway, as well as the reproductive secretions. And so what we see in these patients is a lot of respiratory infections. If we think about the function of mucus, the function of mucus is to clear the respiratory airway of any debris or pathogens. And because of this thick, viscous mucus, we lack that ability to do so. We also see infertility in these patients, right? Can anyone connect why we would see infertility? Why would you see infertility in cystic fibrosis patients based upon what we just discussed? So we talked about the reproductive secretions, right? So the reproductive secretions in these patients is also compromised. It's going to be thick and viscous, and that is going to impede the ability of the sperms to get to the eggs and for that procreation to take place. So this is some of the symptoms that we see, all because of the inability to create that solute gradient to move water, okay? All right, the last thing we'll talk about is another really important mechanism of transport. It's called transcytosis. This is where we can move molecules across the cell membrane via vesicles or vesicles. So at the luminal surface or the apical membrane, we engulf particles or molecules, these can be proteins or granules, and we package them in vesicles, which are basically pinched off parts of the cell membrane. They move across the cell. That process is called endocytosis. And when that vesicle gets to the basolateral surface, it undergoes exocytosis, which is basically fusing that vesicle membrane with the membrane of the basolateral cell, and then releasing that particle out into the interstitial space across into the blood, okay? So transcytosis is really a collective process of both endocytosis at the apical surface and exocytosis at the basolateral surface, working together to transport molecules across the cell membrane.